This Civic Media podcast is sponsored by UW Organ and Tissue Donation. Organ donations are desperately needed, and now is the right time to become an organ donor. Talk to your family. Get the dot. Save lives. Go to heroicdeed.com.
This is the Maggie Dawn Show. My name is Jim Santel, sitting in for Maggie Dawn in this, the second hour of our broadcast on November 11th, 2024, Veterans Day, a time when we are thoughtful about and recognize the tremendous contributions made to our lives and our livelihoods by veterans in our nation's history and also to this day. Spending some time in this first hour and now the second hour of the show talking about one of the great legacies of veterans in America, and that is the courts and the systems of justice and of government that they have supported by virtue of their service on behalf of all of us. Spent some time in our first hour talking about the decision by one judge in Texas to throw out one of Joe Biden's major initiatives late in his term that would have provided an avenue towards citizenship for undocumented spouses. Also, a decision by a military judge to reinstate some plea agreements that will finally resolve the situations involving those 9/11 co-conspirators who were responsible for the horrific attack upon our nation, overruling effectively the decision by the defense secretary to suspend those plea agreements, the plea agreements that now take the death penalty off the table, but keep those defendants in prison for the rest of their lives. And also then talking about this decision coming out of another federal district court, that in Illinois, finding that the Illinois assault weapons ban was unconstitutional, and that coming, of course, in the wake of the Supreme Court decision, narrowing the opportunities to support contemporary, thoughtful ways of appropriately, constitutionally limiting the exposure that is presented by things like assault weapons, weapons of war. Finding unconstitutional the Illinois ban on assault weapons just this past week, likely going up to the Seventh Circuit. Right before the top of the hour break, had a wonderful inquiry from one of our callers. Joe from Madison was calling about immigration, again, in the wake of this decision by the Texas judge on an immigration issue, asking about enforcement in other areas. And yes, indeed, there are an awful lot of existing statutes, federal statutes, immigration, of course, being a federal issue, although states have tried from time to time, including Texas, to become involved in it. Joe's got it just right. There are both criminal penalties, civil penalties. Other things can happen. Employers can, in fact, be prosecuted for hiring undocumented workers. The criminal penalties, as Joe indicated, can face up to 6 months in prison, fines up to $3,000 per unauthorized employee. That's what the Congress has passed a long time ago. Civil penalties as well, that is non-criminal resolutions of these situations, can face civil fines. They could be anywhere from $375 to $1,600 per unauthorized employee. And if that strikes you as low, it should. And of course, that is all dependent upon enforcement mechanisms, right? You can also do some things to prompt those employers to lose their licenses or the ability to continue operating in many ways. And of course, all of that, all a part of our overall historical attempt to wrestle with immigration. But Joe's point, of course, is the important one, which is if you've got the laws and you're not enforcing them, what meaning do they have? And indeed, there is an awful lot of support for the notion that the Department of Justice, U.S. attorneys around the country have not been enforcing these things in the way that they should. To Joe's point, 2023, there were fewer than a dozen employers nationwide who were prosecuted under these laws, probably in part with respect to the civil penalties, dramatically low. And so this is another one of those areas where the Congress needs to act, not only to make those laws stronger so that assistant U.S. attorneys and people inside the Department of Homeland Security, the enforcement authorities along the border authorities, others who are responsible in general and in particular for enforcement of our immigration laws can act responsibly, but also act with the knowledge and the strength that they've got the law behind them to Joe's very good point. Should America be doing more with the statutes we have in place? Absolutely. And indeed, one of the reasons for the legislation that fell on stone, if you will, fell on the street without any further action by the Congress, a lot of the legislation there was an attempt to increase the mechanisms by which, yes, the Border Patrol, the Department of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security can enforce the laws and make this meaningful. That legislation did not pass. And so petition from America to the Congress, to our leaders, to our leadership in the White House coming in and present, to do more things, not only to enact that legislation that was in fact the result of an agreement between people on both sides of the political aisle, but also to do the enforcement mechanisms. All of that was a part of that legislation. And indeed, prosecutors need to do their part. Attorney General needs to do his or her part. The president needs to do his or her part. And courts need to enforce the things that are brought into their tribunals for enforcement. That's how those civil and criminal penalties are enforced. Great point, Joe, and something to be commissioned about and be thoughtful about as a new administration goes into office in about 70 days from now. Immigration, of course, one of the new President Trump's major initiatives, as he has announced. We'll see what he does in these areas and see how effective under the present laws and maybe future laws, if indeed that legislation is resurrected. What can you do to make certain that America is not only a place that honors immigration? That's the foundation for much, not all, but much of our citizenry to this day. And also contemplates thoughtful and reasonable mechanisms for ensuring that the people who come to this country are, in fact, subject to the laws and subject to the processes that are in place. All of those things, those are not two different considerations that fight one another. We can embrace the notion of immigration and the important good things that come from immigrants coming to our land, becoming citizens, even not becoming citizens, here contributing to our society while also ensuring that the laws are properly enforced. That's the commission coming up in 2025 and beyond. We promised, as a part of our discussion here in the Maggie Dawn Show on this day when we recognize the importance of veterans in America, to talk about courts. Because courts, again, are the kinds of things that are supported by virtue of our system of justice that is itself defended by our veterans and others in our nation. Let's talk about a few other things that have happened just in the courts of America in recent times, some scheduling issues, and some other things going on in the courts of America. That man who was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison for attacking the husband of former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi with a hammer in their California home, you recall that well. He was given a life term without the possibility of parole just this past week following a separate state trial. Let's unpack that. A state trial, a state jury just this past week had found, actually prior to this past week, that David DePape, D-E-P-A-P-E, found him guilty of state charges. Those included aggravated kidnapping, first-degree burglary, false imprisonment of an elder, all those things. A jury previously found him guilty of those state offenses. The jury itself brought together to determine Mr. DePape's guilt or innocence in a trial. And all of that followed, of course, the imposition of this 30-year federal sentence upon him in federal prison, which he continues to serve to this day. What is this based upon? This, once again, is based upon the attack, the horrific attack on Paul Pelosi, recall this well, in their home, appearing at the door, attacking him with a hammer, and resulting in serious medical, physical, continuing harms. Before sentencing the defendant in the state court, Judge Harry Dorfman, D-O-R-F-M-A-N, he's the state court judge, not the federal judge. The state court judge rejected the defense attempts to encourage him to grant a new state trial in the wake of the previous jury trial for that 2022 attack. and instead said, no, we're going ahead with this. He said, it's my intention, the judge said, that Mr. DePape never get out of prison. He can never be paroled from the judge's perspective. He said, while handing out this punishment, he said, I don't feel sympathy for you, Mr. DePape. I feel sympathy for the victim in this case who's lucky to be alive. When given the chance, according to all reports, to respond, this is the right that every defendant has in these settings to respond to not only the charges against him or her, the resolution of the case, which again now accomplishes a state conviction, a finding, a judgment against Mr. DePape for violations of those statutes. Mr. DePape himself, who appeared in court, he spoke at length about September 11th being an inside conspiracy. He said his ex-wife was being replaced by a body double and that the government-provided attorneys were conspiring against him. He talked about himself as being a psychic. He said, the more I meditate, the more psychic I get. Now, the judge, again, listening to all of this, defendants can say what they want, interrupted and said, Mr. DePape, several times, what do you have to say about the offense conduct for which you've been convicted and based upon which I'm sentencing you today? And he continued to go on. He ignored those offers to focus upon the particulars of this case. Significantly, when we speak about this matter and other matters in the state and federal courts of our nation, we talk a lot appropriately about the impact of crime upon victims. And we do have a notable victim. Entire community is a victim as a result of this, but a notable victim, his name, of course, is Paul Pelosi. In a letter read to the court, to the judge, the sentencing judge, by Christine Pelosi, Paul Pelosi's daughter, Nancy Pelosi's daughter, Paul Pelosi called for the maximum sentence. He said he has been having the least peaceful sleep and that that sleep had ended abruptly when the defendant violently broke into our home, burst into my bedroom, stood over my bed with a hammer, and zip ties, demanding to see my wife, yelling, "Where's Nancy?" He said the attack, this is Paul Pelosi, left him with bumps on his head, a metal plate in it, dizziness, nerve damage to his left hand, and sleeping at home, he said, evokes memories of that attack to this day. The family obviously seeking the highest penalty here, having gone through 2 grueling years since the time of the attack, and encouraging the judge to ensure that justice is done. And that, of course, the message in that court just this past week, imposing that sentence upon the attacker of Paul Pelosi. When we come back, more about what's happening in the courts of America here on the broadcast stations and the Maggie Dawn Show of Civic Media.
You're listening to Civic Media. Stay up to date on the latest news and information for your local community and Wisconsin by signing up for our free email newsletter. Visit civicmedia.us/email to get started.
This is the Maggie Dawn Show on the broadcast stations of Civic Media. My name is Jim Santel, sitting in for Maggie in the remaining segments of our second hour when we are digesting, we're sampling some of the major news stories coming out of courts in America on a day when we also observe the all-important recognition of our veterans, Veterans Day 2024. They make it possible for the courts of our land to operate and continue to be places where justice, done imperfectly to be sure, but nonetheless, justice in many ways, important to victims as well. Focusing in particular now upon this case involving the attacker of Paul Pelosi. A couple of years ago, the state court judge imposing upon him a state sentence over and above the federal sentence that was imposed upon the attacker. That federal sentence of 30 years, the state court judge imposing a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Paul Pelosi writing into the court, articulated by his daughter, says this: "Today's sentence of life without parole gives our pop," meaning father, "some measure of legal justice, and we hope a measure to others, that political violence against elected officials or their family members will not be tolerated, minimized, or condoned. We must each do our part to build a peaceful democracy." Hear, hear. What wonderful words, again, in the wake of absolute human tragedy and nearly complete tragedy had Paul Pelosi been killed. He could have been killed that night. Nonetheless, a tragic situation. And out of that, the family of Paul Pelosi, of Nancy Pelosi, articulates this fundamental notion that attacks in our public domain on people who are elected to office, appointed to office, who are serving in these positions of responsibility cannot be tolerated. They cannot be minimized, cannot be condoned, just the opposite. And these kinds of things have to be done, sending messages of deterrence for those people who would threaten, and yes, threats themselves are crimes, and in this case, acting on those threats. Significantly, the prosecutors had something to say as well. Said nobody celebrates this. As we've often said, criminal prosecution is no reason for celebration. It too is human tragedy. A necessary and absolutely important part of our criminal justice system involves prosecution. It is not the only avenue for addressing crime and compromises to our safety and security, but it is one of the principal avenues for doing just that. The prosecutors said during the course of this proceeding that the sentence reflects the seriousness of DePape's conduct and also the harm he inflicted on an innocent man. They went on to say, but there is no rejoicing in these cases. There are no winners. Isn't that the message to take from this? A message about the terrible things that come from threats, people acting on threats, and then also this notion that in this situation, for DePape, for his family, for the Pelosi family, for all of us in America, human tragedy, and the commission to address human tragedy through all the mechanisms available to us, including criminal prosecution, very often resulting in imprisonment to address the problems that these people have presented to us, sending deterrent messages not only to the individual, but also to the communities out there. If you do these kinds of things, while we do not celebrate the prosecutions, you will be responded to, and you will be deterred also if you engage in similar conduct. We have another case coming out of the federal courts just this past week. A federal jury found an ex-officer guilty of violating Breonna Taylor's rights. Remember Breonna Taylor? A former detective fired 10 shots through Breonna Taylor's apartment in a raid in 2020, you recall this well, that set off not only a wave of protests across the country, but also resulted in the tragic death of Breonna Taylor herself. The former police detective who fired those 10 shots through Taylor's apartment in that deadly raid in Louisville, Kentucky in 2020 was found guilty of violating her civil rights by using excessive force. Interestingly, however, the federal jury, again deciding this case as presented by the federal prosecutors in that court in Louisville, earlier in the proceedings there, earlier as a part of its deliberation, cleared that former officer. His name is Brett Hankinson, Hankinson. They cleared him of violating the rights of Breonna Taylor's neighbors, and all of that coming out of what's sort of a split verdict as to the charges against him. Hankinson was the only officer to be charged for his actions during this botched operation that set off these protests that I mentioned across the country. The shots that he himself expelled from his weapon did not kill. They were not the ones that resulted in the death of Breonna Taylor. Two other officers fired those fatal shots, but neither of them has been charged in the system. The process here, of course, goes forward to a jury, and as a result of the conviction of former officer Hankinson for using excessive force, Hankinson now faces a maximum sentence of life imprisonment, scheduled to be sentenced in March of 2025. All that as a result of this jury deliberation, this jury judgment of just this past week or so. Not the first time that ex-officer Hankinson has faced a jury. You may recall that last year another judge declared a mistrial after some jurors failed to come to a unanimous verdict. Juries have to be unanimous, as you well know, on some federal civil rights charges, and he was previously acquitted on some similar state charges. So all of that, a long and tortured judicial history on the receipt of word that this conviction, this judgment had been returned by a jury. The mother of Breonna Taylor, her name is Tamika Palmer, she said that the verdict against Mr. Hankinson was received appropriately in the context of justice being done. Said that it had been more than 1,000 days since her daughter's death. She said this, she said, it took a lot of patience. It was hard, she said. The jurors took their time to really understand that Breonna deserved justice. And that indeed is a part of the resolution of this. Also a part of the course of our process where under due process, we present people with the evidence, the jurors with the evidence, and they make those determinations in our court, as they did here, bringing to perhaps imperfect justice a portion of the case involving Breonna Taylor. We'll continue with more of this examination of court cases and other matters here on the Maggie Dawn Show on the broadcast stations of Civic Media.
You're an organ donor, right? Well, here's a tragic fact. Approximately 20 people die each day waiting for precious donated organs. You could make a life-saving decision simply by getting that important dot on your driver's license. That little dot shows those who need to know that you've made a decision to donate organs at a critical time. Go to heroicdeed.com to learn more about the importance of organ donation and how you can make your wishes known. Talk to your family. Get the dot. Save lives. heroicdeed.com.
This is the Maggie Dawn Show. My name is Jim Santel, sitting in on this Veterans Day for Maggie, talking a lot about justice in America, things going on in our courts, even as we observe and celebrate the great contributions made by veterans to our lives, our livelihoods. In major part, courts are able to do their jobs, and judges, litigants, defense counsel, prosecutors, civil litigants, witnesses, jurors, staff, all those people are able to do their jobs because of the service of veterans in protection of our basic systems here in the United States of America. A couple more of those things that have happened even in the wake of the election of Donald Trump just this past week. Other things that have been sort of underneath the radar of the major headlines in our major newspapers. Let's talk about two more of them also in courts, also having to do with the administration of justice. The Justice Department itself, late last week, announcing that there was an Iranian murder-for-hire plot to kill Donald Trump. And the Attorney General, Merrick Garland, announcing that a man who said he had been tasked by a government official before this week's election with assassinating Donald Trump, now charged by the U.S. Department of Justice. Yes, that's right. That is a violation of federal law, a murder-for-hire plan. Investigators apparently had learned about this plot to kill the past and future president while interviewing a fellow named Farhad Shakeri. He's an Afghan national. He identified himself and was speaking to officials, talked about Iranian government assets, and specifically this request, this movement to attempt to assassinate the recently reelected president of the United States of America. He was telling investigators that a contact in Iran's paramilitary Revolutionary Guard, sometimes called the PRG, had instructed him in September, just this September of this past year, to put together, to try to assemble somehow a plan within 7 days to surveil and then ultimately kill Donald Trump. And all that according to the criminal complaint that was released by the Department of Justice upon announcing these charges, the charges pending in the Southern District of New York. That's Manhattan, of course. 2 other men, the authorities also say they were recruited to participate in other assassinations, are also arrested as a part of this overall initiative. The Attorney General himself says this: there are few actors in the world that pose as grave a threat to the national security of the United States as does Iran. The plot with these charges unsealed just late last week plainly reflects what federal officials have long described. We've seen this before in other cases as these ongoing efforts by Iran and by others in the national, international field to target U.S. government officials, including, but not limited to Donald Trump, on U.S. soil. And that's what this plot was all about. It was plainly stopped. This particular individual, again, charged by a criminal complaint now released by the Department of Justice. Last summer, the Justice Department, as a part of that initiative, you may recall, also charged a Pakistani man with ties to Iran in a murder-for-hire plot. All of that a part of the commission, the work of the Department of Justice to address these kinds of crimes, whether they apply to the present president, a future president, officials generally, foreign entities attempting to affect the lives and livelihoods of all of us by undertaking horrifically, almost unbelievably, assassination attempts, conspiracies investigated and stopped by an effective international and national investigative team that results in these kinds of prosecutions. Plainly, these particular individuals still in Iran will not be likely be seeing the inside of a federal courtroom anytime soon. But the notion is, of course, once again, you deter not only them, but you send the message. And if you try to do this, general deterrence, that's the principle. If you try to do this, you'll be identified, you'll be found out, you'll be investigated, you'll be apprehended, you'll be charged, and you will perhaps one day be brought into a court. If you are in this country, you'll be arrested on those warrants, brought into court to answer to your crimes. Another federal court. This one also in Manhattan. Some news coming out of this federal court just this past week. A New York federal judge announcing that New York City Mayor Eric Adams is going to go on trial on those corruption charges on specifically April 21 of next year. The judge announcing that scheduling just this past week. The U.S. District Court Judge Dale Ho set the date in this hearing of just last week in Manhattan, in the federal courthouse there. That was opposed, of course, by Adams' attorneys who wanted some delays there, wanted some further attempts to defend against the case, wanted the trial over the mayor's alleged dealings with the Turkish officials, which, of course, is what this is all about, to be postponed sometime later in the year. You may recall well that federal prosecutors, again through a grand jury there in Manhattan, have charged the mayor of New York with accepting bribes, including flight upgrades and other things, luxury hotel stays, other things like that, illegal campaign contributions, in exchange for pressuring city officials to allow Turkey, the government of Turkey, representatives, officials of Turkey, to permit them to go ahead with a new 36-story consulate building and have that opened despite some significant safety concerns not approved by the inspectors. The mayor allegedly getting involved in that process, getting some perks as a result of pushing the process forward, permitting that consulate to open to the benefit of Turkish officials. The allegations, of course, unproven, and in all of these cases where there are charges and not, finally, an adjudication by a jury, the presumption is in America that any defendant, presumed innocent until proven guilty. That attends upon Eric Adams until, if ever, the government proves this case, once again, a federal case, to a jury selected, a unanimously returning jury finding beyond a reasonable doubt that the offense conduct has been committed, that's the only circumstance under which the presumption of innocence will go away. If a jury makes that finding unanimously and does it based upon a finding beyond a reasonable doubt, it's a high standard for a good reason. It applies, again, in that case, in any case in which there have been charges brought by a federal grand jury, state grand juries, state prosecutors, all of them required to meet that high standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. So that gets us to the other matters that I promised at the start of our broadcast, and that is an update of the conversation that I had right in this broadcast with Maggie just last Thursday about the status of those 4 cases pending against Donald Trump, who again is going to be in about 70 days sworn in as the President of the United States of America. We talked about that Georgia case, the fact that is up on appeal. We talked about the fact that the case there coming out of Scott McAfee's courtroom depends upon whether or not the appellate court will keep Fani Willis in that prosecution status. That's a state case. That's a state case pending there in Fulton County. We also, of course, talked about another federal case to the south, and that is the case in Fort Pierce. That's South Florida. That's a federal case charging Donald Trump with illegally, in violation of federal law, retaining, using, banning about documents, including classified documents to which he was not entitled, that he should not have. That case against Donald Trump, also up on appeal. That one to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, based upon the decision by the trial judge there. Her name is Eileen Cannon, to dismiss that case outright, based upon her finding unfounded, unprecedented, not supported by the law. But nonetheless, she did this. She dismissed the case. Now that decision pending before the Court of Appeals to determine whether or not she was right or wrong. The 11th Circuit has that in front of it. 2 other significant things happening just last week. Again, most of them in the wake of the election of Donald Trump, who continues to face these charges, although with the likelihood that at least some of them, if not all of them, will eventually go away. Let's talk, first of all, about what's going to happen tomorrow, and then again in 2 weeks in that other state case pending in Manhattan. That's the state case in which a jury, again, unanimously, peers of Donald Trump, brought together way back in May, determined after a lengthy trial covered laboriously with great detail by media throughout the United States of America and beyond, finding in the end that Donald Trump did indeed violate New York state law, not federal law, but New York state law, basically in putting together financial statements and records, misrepresenting in those records the actual purposes of monies that were transferred from him to his attorney, his fixer. His name is Michael Cohen. You may remember that well. Michael Cohen turning around and sending those monies, giving those monies to a woman named Stormy Daniels. Why? To keep her quiet about an affair that allegedly happened between Donald Trump and Stormy Daniels sometime in the past. All of that happening immediately after, if you will, some portions of it right after the election of 2016 when Donald Trump was first elected president. And the charges in that case, again, premised upon the notion that even that conduct was an attempt to try to deceive the American public. It was an election interference case that resulted in the end with a jury not finding election interference, but finding that Donald Trump had, in fact, violated the criminal law in New York. And in the wake of that, of course, the responsibility of the presiding judge, his name is Juan Merchan. The responsibility of any judge in a federal case is, of course, to conclude the proceedings. Typically, there are post-trial motions, which there have been in this case, motions on behalf of the defense legitimately made, some of them repetitively made, which is not lost on the judge himself, who's commented upon the repeated motions filed by defense counsel to have the case, the jury verdict thrown out. The judge resolving most of those, but not all of those. Not all of those. And in particular, even as Judge Juan Merchan has delayed at least twice until November 26th, the actual sentencing of this defendant, which is one of the things the judge has got to do in the wake of a jury verdict. It's always the judge. Some circumstances where a jury may weigh in on a judgment. Most times, most circumstances, a judge presiding over the case, he or she is the one who actually imposes a sentence based upon the finding of the jury. So Judge Juan Merchan has said that on On November 26th, right before Thanksgiving, he is going to do this. He is going to call upon the president-elect of the United States of America to appear back in his courtroom, Judge Juan Merchan's courtroom there in Manhattan, to be sentenced for those 34 felony violations, the 34 counts that the jury found. And the judge, of course, has many prerogatives. It's exposure of up to 4 years in prison. Donald Trump will not be sentenced to that high level of incarceration, if you will. Judge has many other opportunities, everything from fines to probation to more limited times of incarceration. That's what the judge will decide, of course, on November 26th. But even before that, the judge has said, I'm going to do something else. He has said that tomorrow, November 12th, mark your calendars, Judge Juan Merchan is going to be issuing his opinion on this pending issue that has in part animated many of these trials, including this one, on whether or not that horrific, that stunning, that catastrophic decision by our Supreme Court on July 1 to find that our Constitution, our laws, our basic principles of the rule of justice and rule of law establish in the presidency immunities, whether that applies to the state case pending there in front of him. The question is whether or not what the Supreme Court said were immunities that apply to a sitting president. The standards in that case that we've talked about a lot on many of the broadcasts here on Civic Media, whether those apply and require the judge either to throw out the verdict or order a new trial, do something else because of the application of that horrific ruling to this state case. Now, the answer should be, and Juan Merchan predictably will reject those arguments. We'll say, no. This is not a sitting president. This was not a sitting president. This was a private citizen at the time, and the small tendrils that cross over are not sufficient. But we'll hear from him tomorrow. Judge Juan Merchan issuing this opinion on whether or not the Supreme Court case affects that state court case. We'll talk more about that and yet another case in our final segment coming up here on the Maggie Dawn Show.
You're listening to Civic Media. Find the latest news, information, and archives of all your favorite shows on the Civic Media website, civicmedia.us.
This is the Maggie Dawn Show. My name, Jim Santel, and this is the final segment of our discussion this afternoon on Veterans Day 2024. All the things going on in the courts of our nation at this time, including tomorrow. Tomorrow, anticipating this major decision by Judge Juan Merchan about whether or not that Supreme Court case back in July, finding that presidents, stunningly for the first time in our history, finding that presidents have immunities from crimes that they may commit in office. Absolute as to the Department of Justice, presumptive, presuming immunities for virtually everything else. Judge Juan Merchan wrestling with the issue of whether or not what Donald Trump did, for which he was convicted in that case in Manhattan in front of Judge Juan Merchan by a jury, does that conduct fall inside or outside what the Supreme Court has talked about? In particular, can the jury verdict be in any way interpreted as an official act of a sitting president? The answer should be no, and so Juan Merchan will probably say it doesn't apply. But we'll wait to see tomorrow what he issues, and assuming that he does, in fact, go ahead and say, no, nothing about that case, that opinion coming out of the Supreme Court prevents a state prosecution under New York law for violations of the false statements and false reporting and false documents matters. Nothing about this case is prevented by the Supreme Court decision. Then on November 26th, we'll also see something unprecedented in our history, and that is the sentencing, presumably, of a president-elect in a state courthouse in Manhattan for violations of state law. Stunning thing. The significance, of course, of that cannot be overstated. Important also to provide a couple of footnotes. That is unlikely, regardless of what the judge does on that day, that Donald Trump will go to jail, won't be detained, almost certainly be stayed pending appeals. And that's part of our process, too. But nonetheless, that system of justice that we embrace contemplates, as we thought we believed in America, that no one is above the law, that we do not have kings, as Sonia Sotomayor wrote in her dissent, and as Ketanji Brown Jackson so eloquently said the same thing. We shouldn't be having these authorities inside the White House that place a president over and above the rest of us. And indeed, a judge, her name is Tanya Chutkan, has said just that in her presiding over the so-called federal election interference case that's still pending in front of her. She has repeatedly said that there's nothing about the campaign as late as days before the election is going to slow her down. Nothing about that political process that was going to affect her conduct of the trial. She was going to treat Donald Trump exactly as she would treat, as federal judges, as state judges, municipal judges should treat any other defendant. No one above the law. And so Tanya Chutkan has in recent weeks and months solicited from the parties their positions on a similar issue, whether or not that Supreme Court case should somehow affect the federal interference case against Donald Trump. That's 4 counts returned by an indictment there in D.C., alleging basically that Donald Trump engaged in a conspiracy, many unindicted co-conspirators in that charge, and determining whether or not the Supreme Court's immunity grant to an executive, the chief executive, prevents her from going ahead. We know that Jack Smith, the special counsel, has already weighed in on that and said no. Nothing to see here. He secured from a grand jury a superseding indictment that responded to many of the issues in the Supreme Court's case, and that's what's in front of Tanya Chutkan right now. Defense scheduled to file their own responsive brief late this month as well, contesting, presumably opposing what the government has said. But a significant event happened late last week, a very significant event. And it's premised upon this notion that we've often talked about, which is that there's a policy inside the Department of Justice that you do not prosecute, cannot convict, cannot bring to trial a sitting president. And as a result of that policy, what happened late last week is that Jack Smith, counsel in this case and also counsel in the Mar-a-Lago case, filed a motion with Tanya Chutkan to stay, to suspend, to delay, basically to cancel all of the proceedings, all the deadlines in that election interference case until he can get back to the court on what the Department of Justice's position will be. And he has asked for time until December 2nd, which the judge has given him to get back in touch and tell the court, tell defense counsel, tell all of us what the government's going to do now in these days, the 70 days or so before Donald Trump becomes our next president. Question is whether or not the case says, including the one presumably in South Florida, will be dismissed, or whether we will continue. The reality is, of course, there is this policy. It is not legislative. It's not in the federal code, the criminal code, the civil code. It is not established as a judicial rule of some kind. It is an internal policy, and we've talked about a lot of those kinds of things. An internal policy says you do not prosecute a sitting president. You can do things after that president has left office. We've seen that in at least these 2 cases, the one in D.C. involving election interference, the other one in Florida involving those documents. Other state officials have done the same after Donald Trump left office. The question is, Donald Trump right now, private citizen, should that policy apply to him? It's my position it should not, and that if the cases are doomed to be dismissed, that should happen on the watch of the next attorney general, the next administration. A lot has been said. Donald Trump has said that he will dismiss the cases himself, perhaps by directing his attorney general to do so. And my advocacy has always been that that's what should happen, and that Merrick Garland should permit these cases to go ahead. They will not see the trial, but permit them to go ahead in the interests of justice here in America. We'll talk more about that and other matters later in the week as I'm appearing on various other programs here on the broadcast stations of Civic Media, including Thursday and Friday, and then again on Saturday, and Amicus, a law review. Join me for all of those discussions here on the broadcast stations of Civic Media. Thank you for joining me today. Have a good week, everybody.
The national news cycle never stops, but it can be hard to find news about your local community. Civic Media is dedicated to providing quality local and state news coverage across Wisconsin. With the Civic Media app, you can get notifications about local stories that matter to you and your community. Find the free Civic Media app in your phone's app store and choose notifications from the menu to tell us what kind of news you want to hear about.